All right, and we are back and joined by Webster Griffin Tarpley. He is a historian, economist, journalist, lecturer, and noted critic of U.S. foreign and domestic policy. You can find his work on tarpley.net. He's also a great Twitter follow, by the way. His Twitter handle is @WebsterGTarpley. You know, he tweets all of his ideas, and I mean, really, you get a real up-to-date view on things that are going on in the world that may not be on his website currently. So, welcome to the show, Webster.
Thank you so much, Jake. How you doing?
Great. There's a smart guy I know. His name is Ted Torbich, and he correctly called the Israeli-Gaza conflict a prison riot. Because what do prisoners do when they are being abused and denied everything? I mean, they freak out and get violent. I mean, we saw that in Attica over nearby here decades ago. They moved to invade on July 17th, the same day as the MH17 crash, to get cover from the Western media. I mean, it's not even clear what this is about, since the catalyst for this event, the 3 dead Israeli teenagers, turned out to be an unsolved situation. So, I mean, what exactly is this about, Webster?
Well, I think it's less important to puzzle about why Netanyahu is a madman and why a madman does what he does, although we could go into that. I don't think this is the place or time. The main thing is what should be done. Now, it's obvious that the Israeli bombing of the Palestinians in Gaza and these, over 1,000 dead, this is an act of barbarism which has shocked the conscience of the civilized world, and I think it's actually begun to shift the balance that had been stacked so long in favor of the unconditional apologists for Israel. And again, Israel is one thing, the madman Netanyahu is another. I don't think Netanyahu is typical. I'm still thinking about the 1 million-plus Israeli young people who came out for a demonstration a couple of years ago that they had no future, that they were going nowhere, no jobs, no prospects, no standard of living, no way to found a family, have a decent home, raise children, and all of that taken away by the neocon and neoliberal economics of Netanyahu. He is the architect of the modern Israeli low-wage, no-future economy is Netanyahu. But let's focus a bit on what ought to be done. The first thing is you need an immediate ceasefire. The second thing is you've got to recognize that the root causes of all this are the occupation, and whatever they say, it remains occupied. Whether they send in patrols every day or every 2 or 3 years changes nothing. It is occupied territory, and most dramatically, it is blockaded. It's besieged. There are no ways in or out. People can't come in. People can't come out. Imports, exports are impossible without special procedures. 50 to 60% unemployment. This is simply intolerable in the modern world. So that, I think, has to end. And while you're doing it for Gaza, you've also got to do it for the people in the West Bank, right? The other larger part of the Palestinian territory. Now, Netanyahu, I certainly condemn him. On the other hand, the leadership of Hamas have a certain amount of responsibility for this because of their ineptitude, because of their stupidity and bungling. Haniyeh, in particular, the leader of one of the leaders of the political side of it, has, I think, painted himself into a corner. He endorsed the imperialist attack on Syria, which I think is just despicable. And Haniyeh has managed to maneuver himself into a situation of conflict with Egypt. And I think that is very, very counterproductive. If you're a small country under siege, wedged in between 2 larger ones, the Israelis on one side and Egypt on the other, it ought to be elementary. You've got to make friends with one of those 2. And if you can't make friends with the Israelis, which you can't, you damn well better make friends with the Egyptians. And Haniyeh doesn't seem to have grasped that, right? This is a little bit like, certain countries in Eastern Europe in the late 1930s, right? They didn't like the Soviets, they didn't like Hitler, so they wouldn't choose, and eventually that's untenable. I don't see any reason why you couldn't get along quite well with General Sisi in Egypt. I think he's reasonable. Obviously, what he's going to want is that Hamas stop helping out terrorists that come out of that territory and then carry out terrorist actions in the Sinai Peninsula. Right? That's what he's concerned about. So give him that. Don't let the Palestinian people suffer because Haniyeh insists on supporting his friends. Part of this has got to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Don't ever forget the Muslim Brotherhood is in a worldwide alliance with the CIA and has been for decades. Now, apart from this stuff, it's clear Netanyahu has to go, demagogue and warmonger. He's got to go out the window. But now the other question is what should happen. In order to face this, you've got to have a Middle East peace conference. You've got to have a Geneva conference. And it's got to be attended by all interested parties, from Egypt to Iran, Saudis, Qatar, Emirates, Syria, Russia above all, United States, of course, the principal Europeans, Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, and so on down the line. India, China, probably also. And what should you do at that? You've got to create two countries, two states. They've got to be independent. They've got to be sovereign. They cannot be subjected to constant military intervention from the other side. And that probably means in today's world a peacekeeping force from the United States or other countries, right? Maybe not the United States. Maybe the Cold War formula was Poland and Canada. Maybe today you could do Poland and you could do Canada and Kazakhstan or something like that. In other words, you've got to get the principal power blocks represented. And obviously, you're going to have the 1967 borders with the exception of agreed-on swaps. This means that most of the Israeli settlements will have to be taken back into Israel. I suggest that the settlers, who are oftentimes people who went there because of economic hardship, they need to be compensated. A fund has to be created for that. If there are Palestinians who have lost their homes inside Israel, they also have to be compensated. In other words, there is a right to return, but it's likely that the right to return will be exercised in the form of an indemnity, that you get damages paid, right? So that the right is respected, but at the same time, we don't create situations that are not tenable after so many decades of conflict and hatred. Jerusalem will have to be finessed. The other thing, though, is the main thing. The economic development program, a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Look at it. Lebanon is devastated since 2006. Syria is now devastated. Iraq is devastated. Gaza, of course, the West Bank, and parts of the Sinai now are also a war zone. Right? Egypt needs a development program. This extends all the way into Somalia and other places. Libya, of course, has descended into utter chaos. So what you're going to need is a Marshall Plan for the entire region, and obviously the principal powers, the U.S., the European Union, Japan ought to be involved, China ought to be involved. The new one on the block, though, is the BRICS Bank. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, at their recent conference in Fortaleza, Brazil, have set up something that I've been hoping for a long time, which is an institutional alternative to the International Monetary Fund. It is the BRICS International or Multilateral Development Bank, and with that money, that would go far towards beginning to rebuild this entire region. And it's got to be a situation where all states benefit. Right now, there is no common interest among them. Only economic development can create a common interest, at least in maintaining the peaceful situation, so that your development investments don't get bombed out of existence in the next war. So I would say those are the things. And obviously, one thing we could do here in the United States is to stop subsidizing this kind of aggression. In other words, you look at this Iron Dome. Well, the Iron Dome was paid for by the U.S. If the Israelis didn't have the Iron Dome, they'd probably have had to negotiate a ceasefire earlier because they couldn't take that punishment. So I think that's indicative of the need to start scaling back or cutting off completely $3.1 billion that the U.S. pays to the Israelis every year. This is in effect the subsidy that allows Netanyahu and people like him to keep being so unreasonable, right? That they're truculent and recalcitrant and won't make peace and defy world public opinion. It won't work. The other thing I would just point out is Israel is now on a tragic parabola, right? If you go back to 2006 in Lebanon, they were militarily defeated. They went in with 4 armored divisions. Hezbollah saw to it that they came out with 3. One whole armored division smashed up and unusable as a fighting force. That was a military defeat as well as a political one. In 2008, 2009, in the interregnum between Obama and Bush, there was this incursion to Gaza, right? Operation Cast Lead. This was a political disaster for the Israelis in the world. There was something similar about 2 years ago. And now we have this. And I think in political terms, in terms of the outcry, the horror, the revulsion against barbarity, then I think this one is very bad for the Israelis. The best advice you can give the Israelis is stop doing this. Stop generating this harvest of hate, which some way or other is going to come home to roost. And I hope that it doesn't.
We also have this just in. U.S. defense official tells CNN U.S. is resupplying Israel with certain ammunition would come from weapons stockpile U.S. keeps inside Israel. So, I mean, we can file that under, keeping anti-American sentiment alive across the Middle East and the entire world and rubbing everyone's nose in the current situation. So that's...
Well, it's an indication of the weakness of Obama. I suspect that Obama would like to find some other way out of this, but of course he's surrounded. The Republicans have unmasked themselves once and for all. The Republican Party is the party of warmongers. Any Republican, above all, any Republican president will be an absolute extremist warmonger. That was clear with Romney, for those of us who could see. But now even people like Rand Paul and company, their response to this thing has been essentially useless, right? And they're not taking a strong, uncompromising, principled stand. Filibustering. You could filibuster something like that, right? You could filibuster a military aid bill to the Israelis, but don't hold your breath waiting for the Paul family to come forward with that. Well, what you've just mentioned would be covered if you cut off the $3.1 billion. Then that flow of weaponry would also dry up. I don't see how you can keep financing aggression with those kinds of humanitarian consequences. And again, I think it would be very much to the Palestinians' advantage to let themselves be represented by the PLO. I think it's much harder for the Israelis to deal with Abu Abbas and Erekat and Hanan Ashrawi and those people who are, I think, fundamentally reasonable, whatever problems they may have. The Israelis have a much easier time dealing with Hamas because, of course, nobody in the West wants to negotiate with Hamas. Egypt, I guess, does, and Turkey does, but nobody in the West. And that means that this Hamas experiment has been a failure for the people of Gaza, right? They should be voted out. And all indications, all the public opinion polls are that Hamas would be voted out. If it came to a vote, Hamas would be out. Now, the only proviso on that is those polls were taken before the current bombing campaign, and I'm sure that the Israeli atrocities have, in some ways, increased the support for Hamas, right? It's the typical rally round effect that you see in just about every country. But and I guess that means another 2 or 3 years of Hamas. But I think it would be also important, if you're going to negotiate a peace, you can do that through the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and let Hamas be represented that way.
It's also hard to fault people that become radicalized that are deemed a demographic threat by a country that's continually bombing them and stealing land away from them. I mean, I personally don't.
Yeah, but look, when you're taking responsibility for leading a couple of million people, right? You've got to have a policy that gets somewhere, right? You can't just act out, your sincere emotions, right? Justifiable those may be. And again, I'm pointing to this question of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and how in God's name you think you can survive against the Israelis if you don't somehow make the concessions to Egypt that are necessary to secure some kind of support from that quarter. Now, this is not just from today. I notice also that some people still think that the United States wanted General Sisi in there. They did not. Remember that Ambassador Ann Patterson, who has now been promoted to Assistant Secretary for Middle East Affairs, she was out there backing Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship at precisely the time that Morsi was proposing to attack Syria. Morsi was going to use the Egyptian army to attack Syria last summer, which was the thing that led to his overthrow. In other words, the Egyptian military said, no, we are not going to do that. We're not going to make war against Syria. You got to remember, Egypt and Syria used to be the same country. It was created by Nasser. It was called the United Arab Republic. And they had Egypt and Syria, and I think Yemen, too, for a while. And the union was not as close as that might suggest. But to unleash the Egyptian army against Syria, this would have been a horrendous thing. And you got to remember, put it all in perspective, right? The death squads backed by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, and NATO, they've killed, 150,000 in Syria, right? So that's several orders of magnitude beyond what we're seeing in Palestine. So it is absolutely unacceptable to have some leadership in the Middle East that says we're in favor of overthrowing Assad. And indeed, right now, the news today is that this ISIS, after having gotten their hands on all those U.S. military stocks in northern Iraq, that they've now turned around and are attacking Assad again with some effect. So that is extremely dangerous stuff. So again, what this all points to, the need for a Middle East peace conference, a Geneva conference. And if you want to see the details, there is a document. It's called the Geneva Accord. It has no official status, but it's November 2003. Yasser Abed Rabo from the Palestinian side and Yossi Beilin from the Israeli side put together what I think is the general outline of what a peace accord would look like. The only thing I would add to it again is the big stress on the Marshall Plan, because without economic reconstruction and development, no political settlement can be effective.
All right, moving on a little bit to the situation in the Ukraine. All signs point to the West trying to move into some sort of confrontation with Russia. Putin seems very, very diplomatic in this whole situation. He's coming across as the sensible one. He's making all of the right moves in the public, and the West seems ham-handed, careless, and incompetent. What are the West's motives here? Do they even really actually have a plan? It doesn't seem like there's a comprehensive plan going forward here.
Well, I think there is a plan, and it's been pursued over 25 years. You may remember that when the communist government of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, or DDR, when that collapsed in late 1989, and then as that was worked out with treaties and the Warsaw Pact was also dismantled, there was a pledge specifically within Germany that NATO would not move east. They even promised, the German government promised that NATO, meaning U.S. and British and so forth, military equipment would not be moved into the former East Germany, that the old German border was as far as NATO would go. But then, unfortunately, under Clinton, and then even more extreme under Bush the Younger, there's been this push to extend the NATO membership all the way to the Russian border. So it's not just Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia. They've all joined. That's, I think, most of those under Clinton. But we get these I think, crazy situations where Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are members of NATO. Means that Americans are supposed to fight and die for a bunch of hotheads and crazies in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They're demagogues, and the only thing they have to offer is anti-Russian demagogy, right? Their economic policies don't work very well. They're all neoliberal, of course, right? IMF shock therapy, deregulation, privatization, destroy the social safety net, bust unions, race to the bottom. So that creates a lot of tension in the society, and they want to unload that by blaming Russia for all of their woes, right? And we're getting people into a frenzy about that. You want to fight and die for that? I'm sorry, no. The answer is no. And this stuff was done, from the point of view of the American people, this was done in the dead of night. In other words, 310 million Americans had their lives committed to these reckless and irresponsible regimes, pretty much in the dead of night, politically speaking, right? Because there was never any U.S. debate, right? Do you want to go and die for Estonia, for example, right? That's the farthest out there. A lot of these places are the countries where Nazi SS battalions get honored every year. So, and of course, that's the case in Ukraine. And the push, I think, from the more extreme NATO circles is that they want Georgia to become a member of NATO. They want Ukraine as a member of NATO, and they want Moldova, right? This area, it's sort of a disputed area between Romania and Russia, more or less. Do you want that to become a member of NATO? So it's again a former Soviet member republic of the USSR. So that's one side of it. The other side, of course, is the color revolutions, right? You have to remember, the basic policy of the CIA and the State Department is to smash all existing nation-states into pieces. This is the mini-states, micro-states, rump states, warlords, secessionism, partition, you name it, right? Failed states, what they've done, right? Look, Libya, failed state, Czechoslovakia split into two, Serbia carved, right, bombed and then carved, with Kosovo being removed and put under criminal gangs, pretty much. Iraq, pretty much de facto in 3 parts now. Plans are ready to divide Iran into 5 or 6 parts, Pakistan into 4 to 5 parts, and even beyond that, right? There's a plan, the Brzezinski plan for Russia, not one Russia, but 3, 4, or 25. And China, similarly, right? Remember, as recently as the 1920s, China was divided into 25 warlord jurisdictions in the mid-1920s. And that's what imperialists want. They want petty, squabbling, pathetic, useless little entities that will never have the power to say no to J.P. Morgan Chase or Blackwater or ExxonMobil, you name it, right? They're just too weak, too pathetic, too much at odds with their neighbors, and that's essentially what the U.S. and the British have been driving for. And one of the ways you do that is with these color revolutions, right? The color revolutions. I warned about this in my book, Obama: The Postmodern Coup, The Making of a Manchurian Candidate. There's still, I think, probably the best systematic treatment of the color revolutions you're going to find anywhere. The current phase, I mean, it goes back to the overthrow of Marcos in the Philippines. It goes back to even Portugal in the mid-70s, right? The Carnations Revolution, right? But specifically for our purposes, 2000, you have this bulldozer revolution in Prague. I'm sorry, in Belgrade, right? In Belgrade, Serbia, right? Overthrow of Milosevic. And then you've had the Roses Revolution in Tiflis, Georgia, to put in the fascist tin pot Saakashvili. And the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, right? The tragedy of Ukraine starts in November 2004 with the Orange revolution, a NATO destabilization, which overturned an election, right? It was a clear victory for Yanukovych, and NATO didn't want that, so they got the Golden Youth, right? You get 20 or 30,000 Golden Youth into the plaza, the main square, and at that point, you know, the fact that there are 50 million people who don't see it that way, that doesn't exist, right? This is on television, so it's a cynical recipe. And then it went on, right? It can be stopped. Clearly, in Beirut, there was the Cedars Revolution, which did not succeed to the extent that they wanted. And now we're getting sort of the second wave, right? Obviously, the Arab Spring of 2011; those were color revolutions in most respects. But now in Ukraine, last autumn, it's a color revolution, but it's not the Golden Youth anymore, but it's now relying on fascists, on neo-Nazis and neo-fascists who collect around this city of Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg in German, Leopold in French. It's the town in western Ukraine. It's been part of Poland at different times. But that seems to be the center of this fascist tradition in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, two different countries, right? The West is practically Roman Catholic, uniate in effect, looking to the Pope in Rome, who really ought to get in there and reform these people. And then the eastern part, Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, and looking to Moscow. And if you want to have a decent government, you'd have to have a balance of those two. One way to do it would be the Austro-Hungarian model, right? The dualism, right? You'd have two virtually sovereign republics, right? Maybe sharing foreign affairs and defense and finance and a couple of other things, but they would have to be on an equal footing, and neither one would be able to impose its will on the other. But that's not what NATO wants now. And so you've got all of that, right? You've got the NATO business. You've got the question of the color revolutions. As I've said, there's also the immediate looting, right? There's a great desire to loot Ukraine. What can you loot in Ukraine? Well, there's the Black Earth region. It's one of the greatest agricultural areas in the world under the secret text, which I've seen, of the International Monetary Fund shock therapy plan, which is now beginning to bite in Ukraine. The Black Earth region, it may be the best farmland in the world, according to some calculations. That's going to be sold off to foreign speculators. There's also this pipeline network. It looks like they're going to be forced to transfer the pipeline network ownership to somebody like Chevron at either a very low price or zero, right? $1 or something like this. Then there's also coal and steel, right? There's Krivoy Rog, which is the steel, the iron ore part, and then there's this area around Donetsk, Donbass, which is coal. So this was, under the Soviet Union, this was one of the most heavily industrialized coal and steel areas in the world, and it's gone downhill to some degree, but it's still there, and it's still lootable. It's interesting that the guy who's been put in as the governor of Donetsk, I believe, one of those two provinces anyway, Taruta, is somebody who's an expert in asset stripping and destroying older industrial facilities. His previous looting job and asset stripping job was to attack the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland. Remember where Lech Wałęsa and these Solidarność union agitators came from? Well, that's been destroyed, and Taruta was the guy who destroyed it. So if you're there in Donetsk, Donbass, you would have to say, well, this guy is coming to destroy my livelihood, my job, and this entire industrial tradition. So there's all that. There's the looting, and then there's world domination, right? Because if you look at the geopolitics, right, there are three considerations that have been important for Russia. Right? Anybody with a high school diploma should know this stuff. It used to be on the New York State Regents examination, Jake. So Here it is. First of all, Russia is landlocked to some extent and icebound otherwise. So the big imperative in Russian history is to find warm water ports, ice-free ports. Well, the Black Sea is not exactly ideal because you've got to get out of it through that narrow channel, right? The Straits, the Bosporus, and the Dardanelles controlled by Turkey. But still, those are warm water ports. Odessa, but also Sevastopol, the naval base, and some others. So historically, they've wanted to have these warm water ports. You can't just take that away. Another question is the fact that Russia has been invaded so many times, right? In the 1600s, it was the Polish forces. In the 1700s, it was Sweden, the Great Northern War. In the 1800s, of course, Napoleon, and in the 1900s, Hitler, or Germany actually twice, right? Once under Ludendorff and Hindenburg, all the way pretty much as far as they got in the Second World War, they got in the first. But then of course, Hitler getting to Stalingrad, and then being turned around. So there's a tremendous sensitivity in the Russian political thinking to the idea that the royal road to invade you is going to be in the hands of a hostile power. It's intolerable. Think of all the hysteria in the U.S. about Cuba being friendly to the Soviets, right? All of that, right? That's 90 miles from our shores. Well, Ukraine is 0 miles from your border, right? So they're right there. And the other one, of course, is the fact that this is conducted under fascist and neo-Nazi, explicitly pro-SS, pro-Hitler auspices, right? Again, that Lvov tradition. You look at these parties. The Svoboda Party of Chanibok, they're in the government. Their armed wing of hooligans, the Right Sector or Pravi Sector, that is, those are neo-Nazi organizations, and they were condemned as such by the European Union when they first got into the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, right? The European Union in Brussels said, "This is really bad. You've got a bunch of Nazis here. You gotta get rid of them." So there they are. So look at this wonderful foreign policy under Kerry, right? Kerry of Skull and Bones, right? The Freemasonic clique that has brought the United States so much woe and slaughter. Bush the Younger, Bush the Elder, all the mistakes that were made and crimes in the conducting of World War II, McGeorge Bundy and the Vietnam War. As soon as you get Skull and Bones into power, you get a disaster on your hands. But apart from Skull and Bones, we've had a foreign policy based on Nazis in Ukraine and cannibals in Syria, right? People who think it's cool to cut open the body of their dead enemy and literally eat their heart. So that's the wonderful policy of the current Kerry State Department. And now there are also psychological reasons, if we have time for that. Putin is hated. He's demonized, right? Why is he hated and demonized? I think you were right to say much of what he does is passive. In other words, he's responding. He's playing a defensive card, right? He didn't try to invade anybody. What he did was he responded to the fact that NATO and the European Union and the U.S. had ostentatiously insisted on having a coup d'etat, a putsch, in Kiev on the 21st of February, violating an agreement that many of the NATO foreign ministers had signed the previous day with Yanukovych, right? So, when Brzezinski wanted to get when Brzezinski wanted to get the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, what did he do? He sent teams in to destabilize Afghanistan in the course of the summer of 1979, and then the Soviets responded. So the idea is, if you insist on having a coup d'etat, especially a fascist one, an anti-Russian one, in a bordering country, there's likely to be some response, right? Compared to Afghanistan, this response is rather contained, right? It's certainly a controlled response. But the importance of the Crimea is that you've got to have that naval base at Sevastopol. Otherwise, you don't have a Black Sea fleet, and if you don't have a Black Sea fleet, you don't have a Mediterranean fleet. And I am one of the few who's actually been to Tartus, Syria, and at least taken a look at the Russian naval facility there from the outside, and that's, of course, a very important part of trying to reestablish some kind of balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? It bears on the Israelis, right? One of the reasons the Israelis can do what they want is that Syria is tied up, right, and under attack by ISIS as well as all these other groups. So I think if you put it all together, now the question of hating Putin, it goes like this: the neocons want to have, and they put this in writing with Wolfowitz in 1992. The neocons want to have uncontested, unopposed world domination militarily, right? They don't want to have anybody that could stand up to them. And, of course, the Russian military can, because they have the Topol intercontinental ballistic missile, right? They can defend themselves. They can't be attacked with impunity, right? And we know nuclear weapons, if you don't have nuclear weapons in this world, you're a sitting duck. Saddam did not have them. Pakistan does. What's the difference? Well, that Saddam was invaded and Pakistan was not. And this, you could make other examples. So Putin provides, even today, a significant counterweight to the lunatic excesses of the neocons. And not just of the neocons, but also this other group that we have to see, right? The ones that have come to the fore under Obama. I call them the humanitarian bombers. Samantha Power, does this ring a bell?
Sure.
This charming redhead at the UN. Well, Samantha Power is a humanitarian bomber, and what she succeeded in doing, it's been well said, she has weaponized human rights. She makes the human rights rant into an aggressive weapon against countries that have done precious little except offend the demands of the U.S. and British imperialists. You can call them humanitarian bombers or responsibility to protect. And of course, they don't protect anybody. Look at Libya. They didn't. They said, "Oh, we have a responsibility to protect Benghazi." Well, today Benghazi is descending into chaos and living hell, and they don't care about it. Right? Bernard-Henri Lévy is another guy, right? The guy who convinced Sarkozy to bomb Libya in March of 2011, right? So they hate Putin because he stands in their way militarily. He stands in the way in the Security Council of having these humanitarian bombing campaigns. What we see, by the way, in retrospect, is that Medvedev's stupidity, I have to say, Medvedev's stupidity in not vetoing the Libyan resolution is something it's been a tragedy not just for Libya, but all these other countries, Chad, Niger, Central African Republic, down into Nigeria, right? That entire Sahel area has now become extremely turbulent because of the weapons that were captured by these crazies in Gaddafi's armories and have now been sold and distributed, all the way into Syria and Algeria and pretty much all the way down to, the lower edge of the Sahel, and I'm sure beyond that, around the world, right? And you want to know where anti-missile systems come from? Book? Well, they could come from Gaddafi. And that, of course, that is what Ambassador Stevens was doing in Benghazi when he was killed. His last meeting was a Turkish official. Why Turkey? Because they were going to ship those weapons into Turkey and then set them loose against Assad in Syria. So Putin deprives them of the direct military intervention card. He deprives them of the humanitarian bombing through the Russian veto. He also deprives them of their color revolutions too, because he's defeated the attempt. McFaul, right, the U.S. ambassador in Russia until February this year. McFaul was sent over there to organize a color revolution, and he failed miserably. And they still have him on MSNBC. So I think this is tragic. Now, concerning the the specifics of this Malaysian airliner, naturally there's no proof, right? We even had this press conference, which I think was sort of a factional initiative, right? Unnamed U.S. intelligence chiefs said the United States, this was, last Tuesday? A week ago yesterday? U.S. intelligence chief said the U.S. has no proof that Russia was involved in any way in the downing of this plane. And there's also a real question, right? The Buk or SAM-11 or S-200 or whatever it is, missile launcher, these missile launchers that they all talk about, these are held by Russia to be sure, but they're also held by Ukraine. And those militaries were fused until the early 1990s. So a lot of them, they know how to use these things and what have you. And these primitive things that have been put on internet, YouTube, Twitter, all this that proves absolutely nothing. The other thing, though, is the Russian accusation that they were Sukhoi 25, either one or two Sukhoi 25 jet fighters of the Ukrainian Air Force in this area. This has been now corroborated. There's a pilot in Germany who, I don't know, and I don't know what his track record is, but the argument can stand on its own. If you look at the pictures of the wreckage, you will see that there are bullet holes in the side of the Malaysian aircraft, and you can see by the way the hole is shaped, right, with the ragged edges on the inside of the plane, that these are entry wounds, right, entry marks for slugs, right, and presumably from a 30-millimeter cannon, a 30-millimeter cannon which is mounted on the Sukhoi 25 jet fighter. The 30-millimeter cannon can shoot either a shrapnel shell or an explosive shell, and these are for tank busting, right? This is like the American Warthog system, right? So the Soviet, Russian, Warsaw Pact, Russia, Ukraine too. They have this too. And what this one observer has pointed to is you can take a segment of the outer skin of the Boeing, the Malay MH17, and you'll see that some of the holes seem to be entry points for slugs from outside the aircraft. Some of them seem to be exit points for slugs coming from the inside. In other words, that the plane was under fire from two sides, possibly. And if that's true, that would tend to bolster the Russian accusation that the Ukrainian Air Force is actually the prime suspect. There's also a very interesting article in a German paper by a former member of the East German Army, right, the National People's Army of East Germany, and he says that the configuration of the debris and the state of the debris indicates that it's not a large surface-to-air missile, because he says if the surface-to-air missile hits a plane like that, it's going to create fire, a very high-temperature explosion pretty much in the whole plane, pretty much immediately. So you would have had a huge explosion at high level. And in this case, that doesn't seem to be the what's observed. Now, obviously, all of this is on fragmentary data. But the other thing I would say about everything we've said so far, they're not worth World War III. And I point to this because we're living through the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. If you take a look at my website, you can see who did it. King Edward VII of Great Britain and his networks, his Freemasonic networks, things like Skull and Bones, quite frankly. These are the architects of this tremendous catastrophe that started 100 years ago and indeed has never stopped. Like everything after that, World War II, fascism, communism, Cold War, you name it, right? Cold War right down to the present time. All of this comes right out of World War I, and this was the conscious goal of King Edward VII and his gang to do it. And this was an international network, existed in France, Russia, in the United States, certainly, all over the place. And they wanted this war because they thought Germany was challenging British world supremacy, similar to today. and war was better in their eyes. Now, we're now in the nuclear age. War cannot be seen as better, if it ever could. So I would just urge people, if you haven't looked at that old movie, The Day After, look at it. And then look at those fascists in Kiev, and you ask yourself, is it worth it? Look at your kids if you have any. Look at your grandkids if you have any of those. Look at them and say, is that worth seeing that go up in these kids and people and the civilization we've been able to build? Is that going to go up in a thermonuclear fireball because there's some damn gang of fascists in Kiev who have their political adventurous demagogic careers going? And I have to say also, it's important to stop this stuff with the Israelis, because in the case of Ukraine, it's a very clear thermonuclear escalation path, right? If you have a civil war in Ukraine, you might have NATO troops coming in from the west, Polish troops, let's say, prime candidates, coming in from the west. You'd have Russian troops coming in from the east. The Russians would have nuclear weapons from the word go. The Poles would demand the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And you go right to thermonuclear escalation, right? Stephen Cohen, professor at NYU and Princeton, now retired, says this is likely to lead to tactical nuclear warfare. Well, once you get to tactical nuclear warfare, hold on to your hat, because the strategic exchange is not far behind. So is that worth it? Is that worth it to go along with Rachel Maddow and these other foaming Russophobes who obviously they hate Putin because of some of his domestic policies? Is it worth it? Is that worth World War III, to meddle in the internal affairs of Russia or the Russian sphere as it's been accepted? Under Yalta, that was their sphere. So,
well, we move from fascist psychopaths in Kiev to what's being deemed in the media as the Tea Party of the left that's sprouting in New York. Two real anti-establishment candidates have sprouted up in the governor's race in New York this year. We have Zephyr Teachout, who failed in her bid to get the Working Families Party nomination and is now on the Democratic Party line, and Randy Critico, who is on the Democratic Party line as well. So what separates Randy Critico from Zephyr Teachout?
Let me just ask you, when you say the Tea Party of the left, is that something you've seen in the press?
It is, yeah.
I'd love to see that. If you want to send me a link, I try to follow it. I'm a little bit, far afield here, but highly interested, right? I'm former candidate for United States Senate in New York State, 1986, trying to get into the Democratic primary, right? Lived in Queens, New York City for many years, in Brooklyn also for a while. Maybe we look at Cuomo also, right? Cuomo, Teachout, Critico. I'm for Critico, but now let me explain why. And I urge people not just to vote for Critico, but to do something to increase his vote, right? Help him organize, get him on your radio show. I guess he's going to be on soon. But this is a vehicle that you can use for positive purposes. I'll try to explain. First of all, with Cuomo, this is naturally the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Party has had a Wall Street wing, which has been dominant, and then there's a pro-labor or populist wing, right? We know who the Wall Street wing goes back to: Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson, Al Smith from New York State, very bad. People like Harry Truman, people like Adlai Stevenson, people like Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Dukakis, Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, right? These are the Wall Street Democrats, and it's fairly obvious. Anybody can see it. Now, there is a minority wing which has popped up from time to time. Thank God, 4 terms of Franklin D. Roosevelt. That's the anti-Wall Street wing, and then John F. Kennedy with the conclusion that we know. So you'd also have to say today, you've got people like Chucky Schumer, you've got Durbin, you've got Harry Reid. That's the Wall Street wing. But there are these other people, right? You've got the Elizabeth Warren in a vague way, Sherrod Brown, you've got Marcy Kaptur, people like this. There is some kind of a quasi-populist, quasi-pro-union wing of the Democratic Party. And as you know, my perspective is that the Republican Party needs to collapse. It needs to be destroyed as a national party. We still have great hopes in 2016. Somehow the Republican Party will just about cease to exist on the national plane, and then it'll become a regional party. But the Democratic Party needs to split into two parts, right? The Wall Street wing and the populist wing, and in an appeal to the public openly, the populist wing, I think, is likely to prevail. So Cuomo, clearly the Wall Street wing. And what has he done? Well, there was a kind of a minimum nominal bank tax. He removed it. And the big thing that Cuomo shares with all the Democratic governors, going back to Hugh Carey, is that New York State has a financial transfer tax, a trading tax, a Tobin tax, what I prefer to call a Wall Street sales tax, because it's clear what that means. You pay sales tax on most items you buy. Wall Street, quadrillions and quadrillions of trading, they pay virtually zero. There is a tiny, 0.000 something or other tax which funds the Securities and Exchange Commission. But New York State has a rather larger version of the securities transfer tax or financial transfer tax or, again, Wall Street sales tax, Tobin tax, and this has not been collected since the days of Hugh Carey, right? Wall Street went to Carey and said, we're going to go to Jersey, and he said, oh, don't go, boys. I'll make sure you don't pay any taxes. Now, why in God's name this place that's got all the money in the world flowing through it can't pay? Some people would say they should pay the New York State sales tax just like everybody else, because they're not a capital market. They're just a casino, and if you're going to buy a derivative, you ought to pay, what is it now, 7, 8, 9%?
In different counties, sure. It's in that range, though.
Something up there, right? So why shouldn't they pay that? Let's start with 1%, but don't go any lower than 1%, which I'm afraid some do. So this is what Credico has been talking about. That Credico says we need to break with the policy of the Wall Street Democrats and go with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Democrats and indeed the tax Wall Street Democrats and start collecting that money. It's estimated that this is about $20 to $25 billion per year. In other words, just apply the law. Don't refund, don't remit, keep that money, use it for education, infrastructure, and all the rest. And at that point, the New York State budget is pretty much in order. So Credico is associated very much with this. He ran for mayor of New York in the Democratic primary, right, up to September last year. That was in the Democratic primary as a tax Wall Street Democrat. And then he went on all the way to November as the tax Wall Street Party on the New York City general election ballot in November. And I think this is the first appearance of the tax Wall Street Party in the United States. And this is not going to be the only one. We're now in the final phases of helping Dan Burdorf, Buhdorf, to get on the ballot in Nebraska as a tax Wall Street Party candidate. This is not the Democratic Party. In Nebraska, the Democratic Party is a dirty word. So the tax Wall Street Party there appears as its own party. In New York, it is more convenient, certainly, to be in the Democratic primary. So that's what Credico has done this time around. So again, the idea is who is willing to go after Wall Street, not just to diss them or to badmouth them, but to start taking back some of their ill-gotten gain. In other words, hitting them in the labanza, as we like to say. So Credico is your guy. Now, he is different in that sense from Cuomo, and we won't go through all of Cuomo's crimes. We don't have time. But Credico is an alternative to that, and he's actually a rather radical alternative. Take a look at Credico's website. It's Credico2014.com. That's all one word. Credico2014.com. And there you'll see him with a cigar, presumably Cuban, and you also get to see the program. Let me just tick off some of these things. Raise the minimum wage to $15. This is now a national consensus, right? Obama is at 10.10. That's not enough, right? Some places have already gone to 15, at least temporarily, right? SeaTac Airport in Washington State, possibly in San Francisco, possibly here in where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. How about Medicare for all? Simply remove the age bracket. You don't have to be 65. You get it at birth, or you get it actually as a prenatal benefit. Because your mother has it already because it's Medicare for all. I urge people to adopt the slogan Medicare for all, as Credico has. If you say single payer, most people have no idea what that means. And as a matter of fact, the overtones of that, thanks to reactionary propaganda, are rather negative. Medicare for all, absolutely clear. Everybody knows it. Everybody likes it. Same thing with Wall Street sales tax. Why shouldn't they pay a tax? And with this, you can also lower your subway fare, bridge and tunnel tolls, and so forth, because you've got this source of revenue. You're finally tapping into Wall Street. You're ending their immunity from taxation. Free college, the State University of New York, all branches, City University of New York, all free. If you want to compete with China, if you don't want to have to learn Chinese to take orders, I think this is a pretty obvious one. He's got some prison reforms, closing Attica that you've already referred to. Obviously, this terrible situation in New York, stop and frisk, this has to end. The draconian Rockefeller drug laws have got to be gotten rid of. You can't keep putting young people, especially young black men, in jail for small amounts of narcotics. Right? In my view, well, this is simply impossible. He wants to have criminal judges elected. And also probe into the Port Authority, right? See how much money Christie stole. Christie was stealing money from the Port Authority to stick it into his own New Jersey budget because he didn't want to raise taxes because of his political ambitions. So he had to make ends meet. So he was looting the money for the tunnel under the Hudson River and other purposes. And then a Franklin D. Roosevelt-style jobs program for full employment. Well, what are you going to be doing with that? Obviously, you're going to be rebuilding the New York Thruway. We got 60,000 bridges in the United States that are in grave danger, and in upstate New York, I'm sure we have, if not 10,000, we're pretty close, right? We're well into the thousands of bridges that have got to be immediately rebuilt. You'd have to then start rebuilding urban mass transit. If you've been in the New York City subway lately, you'll see what happens when you get a system which is now largely 100-plus years old. All of this financed, and I think this is important, not so much by taxes on individuals. I think this is misguided, politically not that smart. Start taxing Wall Street turnover, sales. Don't even wait for profits because they'll find ways to hide those overseas. At the point of sale, when the derivatives are bought and sold, or when they're signed, there has to be a 1% tax. And of course, if you sign your derivatives in the back room, then guess what? When you want to try to enforce them, they'll be unenforceable unless you've got that tax stamp on there. They won't be any good. He does have a more progressive income tax. This would obviously be, increasing the exemptions at the bottom and the standard deduction, and some adjustment of the rates at the very, very high end. But that's on income. And then the income-based real estate tax. I can speak in favor of that. Montgomery County, Maryland, we already have it. It's that if you have old people in their homes And if their income goes down, typically through retirement or something like this, if you go from $80,000 or $100,000 income per year down to 15 or 20, your real estate tax is adjusted downward as your income falls, and that can be done, I think, quite radically. So that's Credico. And the other thing about Credico I would point to is the mentality of a fighter, right? Somebody who was long associated with William Kunstler, the great civil rights attorney and opponent of racism and so forth. This is very strong with Credico. So he's a fighter. It's a radical mindset. Now, how much time do we have left? Can I say something about Zephyr?
Keep going.
Okay, how much time do we have?
15 minutes.
15 minutes? So much?
Yep, we're fine. 15 minutes is good.
All right, fine. Let's see if we can keep going. Now, we look at Zephyr Teach Out. I'm afraid this is certainly well-meaning up to a point, but the Teach Out Woo website, which I've looked at, indicates a very bland, generic, diluted, rather weak program. In other words, it's the classic problem of the left liberal. A lady who, in many ways, resembles Hillary Clinton, right? A lawyer getting involved in politics, in this case, though, coming from a law school into politics. And I'm afraid it lacks the fierce urgency of the terrible situation that working people are in the slums of the cities of New York State, but also the struggle of the middle class. And in other words, what we need is mass traction economic issues. And you can see with Credico, right? You got to put your kids through college. It's got to be free. There've got to be jobs, right? A large, ambitious program of infrastructure, right? Rebuilding all of these crumbling infrastructure elements. This is, I think, with Credico. So I'm afraid this is much too complacent. It's much too mild. It is not going to fare well in this brutal atmosphere. And again, you got to aim your a lot of your program has to be aimed at the lower middle class and people in poverty, but also at the middle class. Just one example now, okay? Let's take. I'm reading off now the Teach Out Woo website, and I'm looking at. They tell you, home, get involved, about news, issues. All right, let's look at issues, and let's look at economy. Right, fair, open, and democratic economy. Well, maybe. The problem here is, as I've tried to stress, the biggest single issue for restoring fiscal stability to the New York State budget and having enough to do these things like free college and your infrastructure program and your Medicare for all, right? The big, ambitious, radical things that will actually change people's lives for the better. We don't find the means to do that in the Teach Out Woo program, right? Because what you'd have to do is stress this Wall Street sales tax, and hopefully call it that, because much is in the name, right? If you can define the name, then victory or defeat are sometimes part of it, right? Wall Street sales tax, I think, is a winner. Medicare for all is a winner. Single payer is a loser. The other loser I think you have is the Robin Hood tax, right? This is not a successful way to talk about it. Anyway, we look at Teach Out Woo. What we find is that in what she's got on the internet, in other words, what she had at the start of her effort, the fair, open, and democratic economy, and you can go and look at it, I've tried to scan through this, and I don't find the Wall Street sales tax. I don't find a financial transfer tax, a trading tax, a Tobin tax. I should probably look and see if I find the Robin Hood tax, but I don't think I find that either. No, so none of that is there. All right. So she's starting off with tax proposals that are exclusively in the realm of the income tax, right? And again, you can debate that, but the one thing is for sure, there's not enough money there. The money is in Wall Street, and the money is in Wall Street turnover. And then we find on the 27th of July, and I'm looking here at the Journal News. This must be somewhere in your neck of the woods, right? The Journal News?
Never heard of it, no.
So here we go. Anyway, the Journal News, Gannett newspapers. And here, Zephyr Teachout speaks in favor of a $10 billion increase in the state's stock transfer tax. She wants a state law requiring periodic revaluation of real estate. Maybe that the bubble prices are now coming down, or something like this. She teaches property law at Fordham Law School. Okay, but how about this Wall Street sales tax? She says she supports a strong and fair financial services tax which could bring in at least $10 billion by expanding the stock transfer tax. But what you're missing here is the outrage, which I think most people would share, if people in New York State knew that there already is a stock transfer tax, which, according to what the estimates I've seen, would be the output of the current existing uncollected or the refunded securities transfer tax, gets you well over $10 billion. I've seen figures more in line with $20 to $25 billion. Now, we have to check that, obviously, but I think what you see is two things. That she's not interested in the securities transfer tax or Wall Street sales tax, stock transfer tax. She doesn't have that in her starting program, but then she adds it. And she adds it, however, in a relatively diluted, weakened, symbolic, impotent form. $10 billion. $10 billion would be great, don't get me wrong, but I think, and she doesn't seem to want to stir people up with the idea that this is now being refunded, right? That the fat cats are getting it back. You're paying, but those fat cats get it back. So I think what we can say is that Credico has pulled Zephyr Teachout significantly to the left. In other words, in the direction of a populist, Franklin D. Roosevelt, New Deal, fighting perspective, rather than a complacent, integrated, left liberal, sort of loyal opposition, symbolic opposition stance. And this won't be the first time. If you look at the New York City election campaign last year, I think you can make a case that the stress on the what de Blasio finally went with, right? De Blasio's idea was an increase in the city tax on incomes over $500,000, and then use that to pay for universal pre-kindergarten. I think that, to some extent, the increased emphasis that he gave that was due to the challenge coming from Credico, who was talking about the Wall Street sales tax there all along. So I think that's the one case I have so far in this election campaign that would show you the difference between Credico and Zephyr Teachout. In other words, who's out in front on the issues, right? Who's leading the charge? Who's fighting? Who's sticking his neck out? And who is hanging back with bland, generic formulations until then it becomes obvious that there's interest in an issue, and then essentially following. It's a question of a leader or a follower.
Well, we need more leaders against establishment, that pressure establishment candidates to actually do something. I mean, we have people like Bernie Sanders who say things all the time. They criticize, like you were talking about that woman who was on Press TV, criticizing Israel, but what are you actually going to do about it? And Bernie Sanders criticizes a lot, but he doesn't really put forth any sort of legislation that people can rally around and get behind. I mean, maybe that's why he's not putting forth any sort of legislation that people can get behind. Maybe he's compromised as well. But I mean, someone who goes after stuff and fights for the issues he actually purports to be for is what we need. Whether that's someone like Justin Amash, who's in Congress in Michigan. Well, I mean, he has some stances that are good. He's anti-NSA.
The proposals are all to cut your own throat. Well, the American people should be pitched into a deflationary crash and stripped of all of their economic and labor rights. Unions should be busted. The social safety net should be shredded. This is an absolute obscene monstrosity. Right? This is the poison spread by that octopus Ron Paul.
Webster, I'm not for their I'm not a libertarian economically. I'm talking about his NSA. He takes the NSA to task on spying. Yes,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't know why that's funny, but
that's not a very courageous position, is it? There was a point here where bashing Bush the Younger was the easiest game in town, and a lot of people could get some radical cover or left cover or whatever they were looking for by bashing Bush. And I'm sure that the NSA is the easiest punching bag in the room, right? I'm against I don't want to be wiretapped, and I'm all against it. But let's get serious, right? Let's be hard-headed. The main issues are mass traction, economic issues, and these other things are largely dodges. And you can see this, right? Joe Sixpack is not so worried about who's tapping his phone. Joe Sixpack has probably thought for a long time that the government taps his phone, at least from time to time. If he ever does anything, right, they might be tapping his phone. But the main problem for Joe Sixpack is, how can I get my sick wife to the doctor? How can I pay my kids' tuition? How can I fight off a foreclosure attempt? How can I make ends meet? Will I be able to get some medical care and so forth, right? And I think that the absolutely critical point is this Wall Street sales tax, because this is just about understandable to anybody. And when you look at people like Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders is theoretically in favor of something that he would probably call the Robin Hood tax, right? This impotent name for, a very small tax. The other thing was those guys, they say that, the Robin Hood tax has to go for the polar bears, the penguins, and the pelicans, and the spotted owls, and all this. They want to give it to the World Wildlife Fund of Prince Charles and the late Prince Bernard of Holland. No, it has to go for the needs of the American people who have to survive, and that's already another big one. I would say Bernie Sanders, if you wanted to take Bernie Sanders seriously, every time he got on television, which he does frequently, he should find a way to talk about the Wall Street sales tax, right, the 1%. If you look, he has been very much in the news lately about this Veterans Administration reform. The problem with the Veterans Administration that most of these bums don't want to confront, it's underfunded. There's now a huge cohort of maimed veterans coming from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other lunatic wars that are flooding the system. The reason they can't get appointments is there are not enough hospitals, not enough doctors. This takes billions of dollars. Now, the Republicans obviously don't want to address that, but the Democrats also don't, because they feel that they're up against it. Here, look, the newspaper of yesterday, Washington Post, July 29th, we're told that Medicare, they're claiming, looks a little bit better. I can't say how this is, but that Social Security is continuing to, the deficits are getting closer, let's say. And in particular, Social Security disability is especially fragile. Without changes, Social Security Disability Fund will start to run short of money for benefit checks in 2016. Now, the reason for that, of course, is there are so many people unemployed, and once they've been on for 26 or whatever, it used to be 99 weeks, it's now 26 weeks, whatever it is in the middle. Once you've exhausted your actual unemployment benefits, the only thing for many people is to try to get Social Security. They're not old enough, right? They're not 62 or 65. They've got to plead a disability, which they often have. So it means that there's a greater number of people who are not working because they've been fired, laid off, and they're going on to disability. Now, at this point, you'd have to say the Wall Street sales tax, 1%, is absolutely essential. And if the Democratic Party stands for anything, it's got to stand for Medicare and Social Security, and not telling us we could cut it. Remember, Obama wanted to cut it with the so-called chained consumer price index. Remember that? That has now disappeared from Obama's budget as of this spring, but it could be back. It could be back in the lame duck session at the end of this year, or in the lame duck session at the end of his term, right, in late 2016, right? Obama has not finished betraying you on Social Security and Medicare. So we need the Wall Street sales tax. And I think, you know, there used to be this guy in ancient Rome, Cato the Elder. No matter what his speech was about, it could be about the budget or some, you know, social issue, and he'd say, and by the way, I want to remind you that Carthage has to be destroyed. Well, our Carthage has to be destroyed is we need a 1% Wall Street sales tax on all transactions, stocks, bonds, derivatives, especially derivatives. And if they don't do that, they're worthless, right? They're just they're fakers. And I think this unfortunately this may apply to Bernie Sanders. And in any case, Mrs. Clinton is Wall Street personified. With Elizabeth Warren, it looks better rhetorically, but I'm afraid, again, when you start looking closely, the content comes out to be rather diluted, rather bland, and she seems to be something like a sheep in wolf's clothing as far as Wall Street is concerned.
Yeah.
Plus, she's also a warmonger on foreign policy. We won't even get into that.
Well, Hillary Clinton is a complete psychopath. Elizabeth Warren actually is kind of a warmonger herself, at least when it comes to Israel.
There you go.
But yeah, Webster, it was great having you on the show. It's always interesting and informative.
Well, look, I want to remind people, Credico 2014, CREDICO. Help the guy out. Give him a contribution. Put up some posters, right? Print out some leaflets. Do something. Don't come whining when the bombs begin to fall that you didn't know what it was. You've been told now. So the situation is quite dire, and the same thing, of course, goes for my friend in Nebraska, Dan Burdorf. This is called danfornebraska.com. Take a look at that. Look at how that works in a farm state, and that would also, I think, apply to some of the agricultural areas. I'm thinking of all those dairy farmers up there in Watertown that were one of my constituencies back in 1986. So thank you very much, and please get Credico on as soon as you can.
Go to tarpley.net, get everything related to Webster Tarpley on there. Thank you very much, Webster, for coming on the show.
Okay, Jake. See you soon.
Talk to you again.
Bye-bye.